James Vaughan is going to introduce our speaker, but I want to first of all say that this is rather a special occasion because we have the advanced copy of our next Adventures with Britannia. Now, for those of you who have not been following this, the first was Adventures with Britannia. The second was More Adventures with Britannia. Still More Adventures with Britannia. Yet More Adventures with Britannia. Penultimate Adventures with Britannia. Ultimate Adventures with Britannia. Resurgent Adventures with Britannia. Irrepressible Adventures with Britannia. Resplendent Adventures with Britannia. And this is Effervescent Adventures with Britannia, which I will pass around to you. And at the Christmas party, which is coming up in a few weeks on Friday afternoon at the Littlefield home, we will celebrate the publication. James Vaughan is going to introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. It's my great pleasure to introduce today our speaker, Dr. John Wilson. Dr. Wilson is a historian of modern South Asia and the British Empire, and he is a reader in modern history at King's College, London, where his teaching and research focus on the making of the modern state and governance in South Asia and Britain, mostly from the late 18th century, I think it's fair to say, until today. He received a Master's of Arts from the New School for Social Research and a DPhil in History from Oxford University in 2000. And he is the author of two very important books, and I don't say that lightly. The first one, The Domination of Strangers, Modern Governance in Eastern India, 1760-1835, is in my own field. And I have to say it's really a magnificent work, and it's not just about the origins and early formation of the colonial state in Bengal. It's really a theory of the modern state itself. I hate to use that tired expression, laboratory of empire. Everybody always claims their patch of the world is a laboratory of empire. Ireland, Scotland, America. I saw a presenter at a conference last week say Nova Scotia was the laboratory of empire. But truly, Bengal is the laboratory of empire of what's known as the Second British Empire. So I highly recommend it. And his recent book, released last year in Britain with the title India Conquered, but released in the US as The Chaos of Empire, The British Raj and the Conquest of India, I highly recommend not just for the scholarship, but to the general reader, because while John is presenting his own interpretation of the rise, development, and fall of the British Raj, Britain's Indian Empire, it's nevertheless also an entire introduction overview of the entire history. So one can also just learn the basic grand sweep of the history of the rise and fall of the British Raj while seeing John's innovative interpretation and conceptual analysis of it. So without any further ado, let me hand it over to Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, thank you. Should I come? Yeah. So I've been asked to stand up, which I will do. It's a great privilege to be here drinking sherry, giving a paper, which I've never done before in my life. So we'll see what happens as we go on with that. But it's a wonderful to be invited to speak here, and kind of a great privilege to be standing here with James and Roger. I mean, James's work has been. James and we don't share entirely the same perspective on things, but James's work is a wonderful provocation, and it's and it offers itself a fantastically original kind of account of the kind of origins of British imperialism in South Asia and elsewhere, and it's hugely important set of work which will have a big, as more and more of it comes out, it'll make a great impact. And it's a real privilege to be here, kind of at the joint invitation of Roger, and to be at the home of the kind of Oxford history of the British Empire, which is not, as everyone knows, Oxford, but here in this place. And my career as an academic, as a scholar, has been exactly coterminous in time with the existence of the Oxford history of the British Empire. I did a DPhil in Oxford at about the same time it was they were coming out, and kind of then when going on to teach at King's. I mean, in a sense, we don't have textbooks, but if there was one kind of during the years in which we, during my years of teaching the history of the British Empire, it was, or at least the starting point for every kind of week was the relevant chapter of the Oxford history of the British Empire. So it's a real privilege to be at the real home of this kind of fantastic set of publications. So as James said, I'm kind of trying to kind of offer a sort of the India Conquered Stroke, the Chaos of Empire, is an account of the history of Britain's presence, or Britain's power in South Asia from the late 17th century until 1947, and which has kind of conquest and the fact that India was conquered at its heart. So my paper, I've slightly changed the title, and it's the Unintended Empire, the conquering of India. I think the British conquering of India, and I'm going to talk a bit about the kind of sort of the full sweep of British rule in India, or the British presence in India, from the late 17th century until a little bit towards the end of the paper, 1947. But as you'll see, conquest remains an important theme throughout. So let me begin. Much of the history of Britain's empire in India and elsewhere is written as little more than a history of the reasons for empire. Scholars explain the growth, survival, and demise of British imperial power with a variety of reasons, of course. Some focus on economic interest, explaining Britain's expanding political role in the subcontinent with reference to merchants' search for markets or bureaucrats for revenue. Others look to geopolitics, identifying a grand strategy whose goal was British dominance in the subcontinent and the defeat of rival European powers. Still more attribute empire to ideology or discourse, tracing British actions back to different ideas about the well-organised economy or intellectual schemes which exalted European and denigrated Asians' capacity to rule and desired the transformation of the non-European world. In each of these arguments, the growth of imperial institutions is attributed to the actions of individuals who had a clear idea of empire in their minds and used the instruments at their disposal to achieve those imperial goals. Even historians who emphasize the importance of Asian agency in creating the conditions for empire do so by tracing the rational economic or political arguments which Indians used to defend their cooperation with the British. Within these stories, no single set of historical actors were ever able to entirely get their way, of course. Each imperial history allows contingency to intervene in some form, whether through the resistance of indigenous Indian powers in the late 18th century or the rise of the United States in the early 20th. But in all cases, empire is seen as a project and then perhaps also as a system, and a chain of and most importantly, it's a chain of rationally conceived actions which are supposed to connect the two and turn a project into a system. This way of viewing empire would have puzzled all but a very few of the people entangled within, whether as agents, victims, or bystanders, the institutions of British imperial power in India. With very few exceptions, British civil and military officers had a far narrower perspective. They were concerned with their survival, their reputation, their income, their immediate work, and most importantly, their return to Britain rather than grand imperial projects. From the 18th to the 20th century, a few political leaders took a broader view, articulating one imperial idea or another to Parliament, to the British public, or to British imperial officers. But as they recognised themselves, those projects did not get very far and were blunted by the dispersed and chaotic real life of imperial institutions. Frequently, well, almost invariably, the idea of an imperial plan or system was little more than a rhetorical device used by men who wished to defend their immediate position against criticism at particularly acute moments of crisis, and plans seem to emerge at moments of crisis. Critics of empire had a broader perspective often. The British Empire often existed more sharply focused in the minds of nationalist opponents than its defenders in the early 20th century, for example. But their criticism, and one only has to read Gandhi, for example, was of empire's chaos, its irrationality, its waste, not its systematic, and rarely its systematic ability to impose its will on India's population. Britain's empire in India did have a pattern and a logic, I want to argue. But it is something that's amenable to historical explanation. But its shape was not determined by the rational intentions of its protagonists. The problem, I think, perhaps is with the word empire itself, particularly with the way we assume it refers to a more or less stable set of phenomena which exist across space and through time, from the 17th century to the mid-20th century, and sometimes even to the present. As scholars, of course, we need to divide our subject matter. Empire is necessary as a category in order for our academic institutions, our seminars, journals, university courses to function as they do. It has been particularly prominent in the last couple of decades when, in the wake of globalization and Iraq, particularly here in the US, empire has been a way to sell history books, and I'm a beneficiary of this fact. Kind of a not unhappy beneficiary. To give a personal example, my American publishers insisted that a book which is in Britain is titled India Conquered, and the word that they really insisted to have in the title was the word Raj, which is in the subtitle, became The Chaos of Empire, which is what it is in the US. But the prevalence of the category of empire allows us, I think, to sometimes lazily slip into the assumption that it had the same importance for the people we study as for us. In practice, the people who historians of empire study existed within a much more complicated set of institutions than can ever really be understood with that word. And they were usually doing something much more mundane than putting any imperial vision into practice. So this paper is an attempt to pull scholars away from the seductive lure of structures, which I think bedevil the history of empire sometimes, and in the process challenge what I think are the far-fetched efforts to explain the rise and fall of empires with reference to rational, purposive systems of ideas and interests. So British political sovereignty in India was produced and sustained by the actions, but not by the intentions of British officers in the subcontinent. And one central argument I want to make here is that those actions were driven by emotion as much as by reason. So instead of a plan or a strategy, the violent acts which extended imperial power were driven by individuals' passionate responses to particular situations, and passion is the word they would have used in the 18th century. Imperial conquest occurred as historical actors responded to their situation in South Asia with feelings such as fear, paranoia, their desperation to avoid humiliation, their desire for vengeance, and their lust for glory. Much of the time, empire then endured simply through the emotional momentum which a dominant but embattled British presence had gathered for itself, including, of course, the private self-interest, which a few thousand well-paid men and their families had in their incomes and pensions and ways of life, as well as their personal feeling of dominance over the very small worlds they immediately controlled. So Britain's empire in India, I want to suggest, was unintended in that it was the result of a series of actions which did not have the creation of empire as their goal. It was essentially purposeless. In a sense, and that's a word that the economist and writer on empire Joseph Schumpeter uses to describe it, and I think he was right. Established to further no great strategic goals and justified by no reasons other than those it created by itself. So the passionate, involuntary and purposeless character of the process by which the British power spread powerfully shaped the nature then of British rule in three important ways, which we'll see throughout the examples I talk about in this paper. From beginning to end, the British presence in India involved an emotionally charged interaction with groups of Indians who were the objects of fear and humiliation as well as self-interest. As a consequence, violence, which was often sporadic and unstrategic, was a constant component of British power. British power expanded through a highly contingent and unplanned process of conquest, where regimes that were often recent allies were rapidly forced to submit to British power. And of course, there were many defeats on the way. So I'm not suggesting that the British won even a large proportion of the battles they fought. Secondly, with no grand vision of imperial domination, British institutions spread across Indian territory in a highly uneven and unsystematic character. Even at the height of empire, the only systematically governed spaces were the forts, district towns and presidency cities where the British lived and protected themselves. Elsewhere, the British presence was dispersed, often weak and never capable of securing any but the entirely negative purpose of ensuring no rival authority was able to challenge their power. Third, the violent and uneven character of British rule makes it impossible to trace its history through a smooth process of evolution. Instead of an even arc in which structures slowly change through time, growing, consolidating and declining, the exercise of power kind of altered in a staccato fashion, with rapid expansion, quick reverses and moments of possible and total collapse. And one example there is the 1840s and 1850s, where British power in some ways is at its greatest height, and then you have the Great Rebellion of 1857 and it's collapsed. What's more, despite their overwhelming capacity to exercise military violence to its protagonists, the uneven character of Britain's institutions made imperial power seem unstable, endangered and fragile. This was a regime whose dominant mood was anxiety, and that's the concept I'm obsessed by, some would say. The nearest British rule in India came to being something other than this was in the first half of the 20th century, during two periods of World War. Then, empire in India was indeed deployed as part of grand strategies and global purposes, as the base from which the Middle East was conquered during the First World War and the Japanese Empire then defeated in the Second. British institutions did need to systematically assert their power through India in order to mobilise the men and resources needed to achieve those victories. But the danger, I think, is that we read backwards from these aberrant and also unexpected moments and imagine that Britain's presence in India was built and designed for the kind of global role exercised in those short, late years. In fact, the opposite is true. It was the wartime effort to create a purposeful regime which finally destroyed British imperial sovereignty in India. So, as I suggested a moment ago, an account of Britain's presence in India which refutes the idea of empire as a purposefully sought system of domination is necessarily episodic. So my discussion in the rest of this paper is going to be episodic too. For the rest of the talk, I'd like to provide some texture to my account by considering a number of episodes, five mainly with varying amounts of detail. Firstly, the Anglo-Mughal War of the 1680s. Secondly, the Anjengo massacre of the 1720s. Third, the Battle of Plassey in 1757, seen by many as the beginning of British conquest. The 1857 rebellion, and then I want to think about the Amritsar massacre of 1919, all apart from one kind of very well-known events in the history of British Empire in India. But by tracing the forces driving British violence, or kind of through these moments over this kind of implausibly long time space, I want to trace the mentality, what I want to call the mentality of embattled dominance that ruled British actions in India, to argue that it was that, rather than a coherent vision of empire, that offers the best analytical framework to think about 3 centuries of British power in the subcontinent. So ideas and interests changed dramatically during these 250 years. But Britain's presence in India was based on an almost visceral set of attitudes and what Schumpeter called psychological habits of emotional reaction, which in more or less the same way endured for something like 2.5 centuries. Dangerous sip of sherry. So. Imperial power grew then in India, not as the working out of an idea or a project, but from the British use of violence in response to particular situations. The use of force in India was imagined as a possibility from the foundation of the East India Company right at the beginning of the 17th century. From the start, the goal, of course, of the East India Company's voyages was trade. But as a kind of a recent historiography rightly suggests, merchants and political leaders decided to create a corporation, a political entity, to give English trade the support of a potentially armed organisation in countries thought to be risky and dangerous, where there were similarly armed European rivals. In the 17th century, this position was influenced by debates about whether it was possible to trade successfully with non-Christian princes. The East India Company made what its critics saw as the medieval, or as they described it, monkish, fantastical and fanatical argument that non-Christian rulers would not abide by the rules of Christian civil society. In particular, they wouldn't honour their treaties, so trade, it was argued, needed to be accompanied by the sword. No doubt partly based on genuine theological conviction, these arguments nonetheless conveniently justified the concentration of power with the men who controlled the company. They were arguments that were vigorously criticised by merchants and politicians who advocated free trade throughout the 17th century. But the company's growing financial institutional clout meant it was usually able to win the debate. So, as a way to combat the perceived threat from supposedly warlike Indian princes, foreign powers and British traders keen to challenge the East India Company's monopoly, the company was structured from the start, or from the middle of the 17th century at least, as a tightly managed organisation whose officers were given detailed instructions about their conduct from London. Company officials in India constantly feared their being dismissed by their masters. So this institutional form, together with the relatively short space of time that officers spent in India and the climatic risks they were exposed to, allows what I've described as a sensibility of embattled dominance to emerge. So what I mean by that is that by the late 17th century, the men who controlled the company's destiny argued that the only way to survive and profit in India was to absolutely dominate a portion of physical territory. There was no aspiration to empire here in the way we would understand it, but instead there was the desire to possess some kind of space, kind of fortified space, a series of forts along India's coastline and rivers, which would give the company clout to negotiate with Indian merchants and rulers, and to which the company's staff could retreat in moments of crisis. In practice, of course, the British presence depended on Indian intermediaries and employees, whether the merchants and agents connecting company traders with centres of commodity production, or usually female labourers who provided the water supply by hand in some of the company's southern coastal outposts. But each fort's thick walls allowed British officers to imagine that they were self-sufficient, that they were alone and embattled, and to neglect their relationship with local society. The gap between the reality of interdependence and the idea of isolation added to British anxieties. So one could argue that the fort was the dominant institution of Britain's presence in India from the late 17th century to even, I think, the mid-20th. British settlement clustered around forts, even when they were distant from the old centre of Indian cities, in particular when they were so distant. Fortified cantonments remained at the centre of cities, that cities sort of grew around throughout the period of British rule until 1947, and in many ways beyond. And there's a very interesting history about the history of the cantonment in Indian cities after 1947, in that the nationalist Indian government basically wanted to get rid of them, but if you like, it's the continuation of some of the sensibilities I'm describing meant that they weren't. And you now go to many South Asian towns and you find the fort right in the middle of the city. The forts of the regimes which preceded the British in India, the Marathas, for example, were often stationed on hilltops with defensible positions which nonetheless also surveyed the surrounding countryside with the prospect of attack and domination in mind. In contrast, British forts were places that the British merely wanted to retreat to and defend, as occurred repeatedly from the 1680s, throughout the 18th century and the 19th. Most iconically, of course, in the rebellion of 1857 with, for example, the retreat, defence and relief of Lucknow. It's striking that the most keenly memorialised events in the imperial history of Britain in India were of retreat, survival and defence, not of domination. So fortification, I'm arguing, produced a dynamic in which ever-expanding violence created imperial institutions without empire ever being an object consciously sought. Forts allowed the British to imagine they could profitably exist in India in spaces they controlled absolutely, whilst also creating an emotionally laden desire for aggression when those spaces seemed endangered, as they often were. It was that dynamic, I want to suggest, which drove the process of British conquest from the 1750s. But, and this is the point I want to stress, it's something that occurred from at least the late 17th century. So if Britain's empire in India had a founding moment after the creation of the East India Company itself, it was the Anglo-Mughal War of the late 1680s. In those years, English, not yet British, forces were sent to occupy and conquer land from Emperor Aurangzeb's Mughal Empire. The consequence of this, I suppose to a general public, little known and incredibly hubristic effort, the effort of a minor but growing European power to defeat an empire, a sort of globally significant empire, which was still able to deploy troops throughout every part of the Indian subcontinent. The consequence was humiliating disaster and the near collapse of the company's trade for almost a decade. So why did it happen? Events in Bengal, I want to argue, precipitated conflict, in particular an increasingly fractious relationship between the company's offices in the Mughal capital of Dhaka and the largest port of Hooghly during the early 1680s. Conflict was fueled by the presence of private English traders who were trying to negotiate a relationship with Indian rulers and merchants in defiance of the East India Company's monopoly. So in defiance of the company's desire to control the things it wanted to control absolutely. The Mughal regime's refusal to emphatically back the company rather than its rivals, and the frequent stoppage of English trade which occurred, encouraged an impatient mood to develop amongst English officers. And officers who were always worried that if they didn't send goods back in time, they would be sacked. They would get a letter in the next ship that would tell them that they were out of their job. So there's kind of incredible pressure and anxiety here. So an impatient mood to develop amongst English officers, which was communicated back to London. So William Hedges, chief in Bengal until the mid-1680s, wrote that trade could only improve if we, quote, resolved to quarrel with these people. His rival and successor, William Gifford, argued that trade wouldn't be secure until the company, quote, fell out with the government and could oblige them to grant better terms. No good was to be done with these people without compulsion, he said. The language used in both London and India emphasised the humiliation of constant Mughal harassment. Officials talked of the company's misery and thraldom, and the Mughal regime trampling upon us. In pure financial terms, if K.M. Chowdhury's numbers are good to go by, and I think they are, these were some of the most profitable years in the East India Company's history. Bengal had very recently taken off as a source of goods to sell in Europe. But conflict wasn't promulgated by the exact calculation of profit and loss, but instead by the highly emotive sense that the company in India didn't possess the capacity to control things that it believed it should. The solution and the first goal for the company's firepower was to acquire the town of Chittagong on the Bay of Bengal, although British officers when in London at least didn't have the faintest idea where Chittagong actually was, which is a bit of a problem if you're trying to invade somewhere. But which was to become an English base. In fact, the weather, bad military decision-making, and the strength of the Mughal military meant that the 19 vessels which left England to teach the Mughal a lesson got nowhere near their destination. When war spread to the west of India, the company island port of Bombay was besieged by Mughal forces for almost a year before starving English forces and their Maratha allies were forced to surrender. The most sophisticated recent interpretation of this war suggests it was a product of different sets of economic interests in England, which then map onto kind of sort of ideological debate in various kind of interesting ways. And I'm persuaded that a lot of those debates did take place. The arguments I'm talking about kind of end up, I think, imputing too much coherence and stability to sharply distinguished ideological positions when arguments and alliances quickly shifting in the melee of late 17th century metropolitan factional politics. And also it's unclear about the relationship between kind of one set of arguments from London and another, and the kind of actions that occur in India itself. Because conceivably, a war to conquer a fort could have been it can be justified by a whole range of arguments that, in London, whether they're arguments about the need to profit from revenue, to dominate land, or even kind of blue water arguments that kind of support free trade. The point was to make sure that the British had some kind of like physical foothold to be able to do those things in the subcontinent. In each case, I think our kind of attempts to explain imperial acts overstates the amount of rational calculation which preceded the decision to fight. The decision to go to war was not a purposeful act committed with the intention of achieving a well-defined goal. Instead, even in London, the tone of discussion was highly emotional about the need for a response to slights and insults and to avenge humiliation, rather than to compute profit and loss. So war had been driven by the company's desire for fortified territory, which the English could absolutely control. The drive, if you like, the drive to acquire that led to was only stopped because the Mughal regime was able to deploy forces that frightened the English from invading Chittagong and then defeating the English at Bombay. Had the Mughal Empire been weaker, the English desire to undo their apparent humiliation against Indian harassment might have led to some kind of company empire in the late 1680s, even though that was not the goal. Paradoxically, though, defeat fueled the dynamic which had led to war in the first place. When Emperor Aurangzeb allowed the company to return to its settlements, fort-making accelerated, but now often at a distance from centres of Mughal power. William Hedges' great rival Jog Charnock founded Fort William or Calcutta in the early 1690s on the plot of land to which company officials had fled, the plot of swamp they'd fled after being driven from the Mughal centres of Hooghly and Dhaka. The point about Calcutta, it was not near anywhere that anyone really wanted to be. Elsewhere, forts were strengthened to protect the cotton and pepper trade along the coast of southwest India, beyond the immediate reach of Mughal military forces at Karwar, Tellicherry and Anjengo, for example. In each case, is the psychology of embattled domination which drove their construction, pulled the British into precisely the kind of violent dynamics which they were built to avoid. So, moving on a little bit, it's easy to mistake the first half of the 18th century as a period when the East India Company was comfortably at peace with Indian rulers and profitably trading in the Indian subcontinent. But in fact, the period saw frequent fractious exchanges and minor skirmishes. So between 1690 and 1757, the moment when the company came, when one might say conquest began, the nearest the company came to conquest was, I think, in 1721, when the British armies attacked the countryside near the west coast, on the west coast of India, near the far southern tip of India. So my kind of second story is about how the dynamics of conquest are at work, the dynamics that later lead to conquest are at work in a time and place where scholars normally think they're not. So the British attempt to invade the countryside right at the far southern tip of India in 1721 came in retribution for a massacre, for the killing of all but a few British officers who staffed the small pepper fort of Anjengo. Conflict began with a dispute between William Gifford, chief of the fort and son of William Hedges' successor at Hooghly. Company was nothing if not a family enterprise. And a group of Indian merchants who tried to bypass him and trade with another local English merchant who maintained a better relationship with him. Again, the issue is about the British failure to control things in their own immediate purview. Gifford's location behind the walls of the fort allowed him to imagine he could get away without negotiation. A Portuguese employee of Gifford's humiliated 3 Muslim merchants who'd come to reason with him by dousing them with coloured paint on Ash Wednesday, then shaving off their beards. Fighting broke out, but was subdued with the help from the Queen of the local principality, the local state, who relied on the company's participation in the pepper trade for a large portion of her income, and so was desperate for peace. Gifford decided the company should make a show of its power, though. So he marched to ceremonially submit the token tribute which Queen Amutambaran asked for, with guns displayed and full military regalia, which was an incredibly dangerous thing to do, it turned out. The company's assertion of their capacity to exercise violence in this symbolic fashion escalated the local population's anxieties and brought retribution in the form of real force. Most of Gifford's retinue were disarmed when they arrived at Queen Amutambaran's own fort and killed, with Gifford's own body cut to pieces. Those who remained were besieged in Anjengo fort and defended themselves, and again the siege is crucial to the stories of British Empire in India, defending themselves for 7 months throughout the summer until a small fleet sailed down from Bombay and other ports to secure the British position. In a few days, a considerable acquisition of land was conquered from the natives, as one observer put it, by company troops. This is a conquest that no one ever talks about. It didn't last long. The pepper trade was not in danger. Queen Amutambaran was desperate to restore her income from it by granting the company whatever concessions were necessary. Instead, violence was driven by a desire for revenge, by the kind of need to restore the tattered honour of the English nation, as one observer put it, by making a sufficient example of the murderers. In fact, there was no conquest, and the kind of seizure of territory didn't get very far, and the land was relinquished. The reason why was that company's soldiers were ordered to suspend their action in Kerala and to return north, because the British felt that the nearby Marathas, the dominant kind of Indian power in the west, along the further north, the west of India, were becoming an increasing threat to the fort of Bombay. So the mid 1720s saw the outbreak of a sea war between the East India Company and Maratha forces along the Konkan coast and further north, which in this case blocked the operation of the company's unintended dynamics of conquest elsewhere. The result was that the region around Anjengo was never conquered and continued to be governed by Indian monarchs or Indian princes until 1947. So in both the Anglo-Mughal War and the Anjengo massacre, we see at work a constant, enduring dynamic which allowed violent, potentially conquering acts to occur. In both kind of instances, kind of British actions are ruled by what I've called a sentiment of embattled dominance, which drove conquest. But also, so to kind of to explain conquest, we need to explain where that comes from, as I've discussed. But we also need to understand why that dynamic led to British victories and the British conquest of territory at some moments, but was blocked at others. And here, the ebb and flow of Indian politics becomes vital for our story. And I want to move on now to my kind of third sort of story, third incident where the ebb and flow of Indian politics becomes vitally important, and that's the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which was the first occasion when company soldiers went into battle and defeated an Indian ruler, not under the flag of an Indian ally, but in their own right. So if there's one moment when the British conquest of India began, and I would contest the idea that it's a useful idea to see that there as being a single moment, but if we do insist, then that moment would be the Battle of Plassey. By 1757, the East India Company had been present in Bengal for nearly a century, first in the Mughal port of Hooghly, then in the fortified city of Calcutta, which we discussed a moment ago. Just as in other regions, relations between the company and the Nawabi regime in Bengal, so power had been sort of dissipated from the Mughal Empire to a series of regional regimes, and the Nawab's regime in Bengal was one of them. But the relations with the company and that regime were fractious. Bengal's rulers benefited, though, from the company's connection to European markets, but they were also anxious about the company's desire to build ever larger forts, and what they saw as its violent sensibilities, and were worried that the English East India Company was interrupting the balance of power in the province. They were worried about wars between different European powers, and they were also concerned about the effect that these kind of centres of potentially kind of challenging power might have on their own authority. Correspondingly, the British thought that the kind of Nawab's efforts to keep them in check was unjustified meddling in the company's legitimate privileges, and they tried when they could to increase the violent capacity of their settlements to defend themselves. Nonetheless, until the 1740s, a fractious peace was maintained because the Bengal regime was simply too powerful to allow the company's conduct to get out of hand. But that changed in the middle of the 1700s, and it did so because of a series of events that started a long way away in Iran. The kind of upstart, as he used to be described, Persian warrior leader Nader Shah had overthrown the Safavid dynasty in the 1730s, and then in 1739 marched west to consolidate his power by seizing the throne of the Mughal Empire in Delhi. He defeated the Mughal Emperor, briefly declared himself emperor himself, and then returned to Iran with vast amounts of plunder. In the process, Nader Shah's invasion shook India's political system, which up until that point had more or less maintained peace in India's provinces. The knock-on effects, and they're too complicated to go into in detail, in Bengal were a succession of Maratha invasions. So Western India state or Western Indian soldiers kind of sort of marched eastwards and kind of raided Bengal. A financial crisis, and the emergence of a number of competing claimants to rule the province of Bengal. So when the new Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah succeeded to the throne in 1757, these crises meant he faced challenges from rival political leaders to the east and to the west, from all across the province of Bengal. The East India Company was pulled into that crisis as its increasingly fortified settlements. As I said, the forts are central to the story. Particularly Calcutta became a refuge for different factions. So the factions that are kind of trying to kind of oust Siraj-ud-Daulah to stop him from being the Nawab kind of come to Calcutta and use Calcutta as a base, and that's a dynamic that happens in other parts of India, and one of the reasons why the British become pulled into Indian conflict. So one rival to the young Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah sought protection for his relatives and his assets in Calcutta. And to counter the apparent growth of a political challenge emanating from the English settlement, in December 1756, the Nawab occupied the English city and it expelled its English inhabitants. And of course, I think most of us will have heard of the Black Hole of Calcutta, and that event occurs where a group of British officers die from suffocation in a small prison occurs at that moment. So I'm suggesting here in this paper that the process of Britain's conquest wasn't driven by economic interest, but certainly the British did have very, very good interests for reconquering the city of Calcutta. It was, of course, directly in interest. It was an essential trading base. It was kind of, contained their storehouses and contained a fort that was able to protect their commercial role in the subcontinent. But the question is why they, in 1756 and 1757, why they stop at retaking Calcutta. And do things that go beyond kind of, if you like, the sort of rational economic interests which seem to present themselves. So the continuation of conflict with Siraj-ud-Daulah doesn't make much sense unless one thinks about other, and I'm arguing kind of emotional drives being at work. As contemporaries noted, no rational interest justified the decision by Robert Clive and his colleagues to continue fighting until Siraj-ud-Daulah was defeated and then killed. The only way to explain these actions is by talking about sort of habits of feeling and kind of psychological habits of emotional reaction. That's a phrase from Joseph Schumpeter. In particular, we should look at the feeling of humiliation and the desire for revenge, which the oversensitive British felt to a heightened degree in the subcontinent, together with the attempt by individuals such as Robert Clive to seek martial glory. So, the story. To recapture Calcutta, a British army gathered together in Madras and then sailed north, led by Colonel Robert Clive and Admiral James Watson. The mood was certainly not of calculation. Every breast seemed filled with grief, horror, and resentment, Clive said. His troops were full of spirit and resentment, as they put it. Clive was always conscious of the way his actions would be perceived by a hopefully admiring public back in Britain. The recapture of Calcutta was, he thought, his chance for glory. The expedition, he wrote to his father, if attended with success, may enable me to do great things. And I think actually what he was talking about was have an impressive political career when he got back to Britain. I think that's his main aim. It is by far the grandest of my undertakings, he vainly said. The Nawab's forces were pushed out of Calcutta by forces led by Clive relatively easily. And the changing geopolitical situation in India, which the British knew about, meant Siraj-ud-Daulah in fact had quite good reasons for giving in quite easily and for not continuing to fight the East India Company. India had been invaded in 1756 from Afghanistan, again with the Afghan warrior Ahmad Shah Durrani trying to emulate his hero and mentor Nader Shah in subjugating the Indian subcontinent. And Siraj-ud-Daulah was worried that these Afghan occupiers, or else the Marathas, and a Western Indian state, would occupy a weakened Bengal. So he was kind of desperate for allies, and even ones who he was worried about, anxious about, such as the British. And this had changed between the moment when he occupied Calcutta and the British reconquest. So as a consequence of these developments, Siraj signed a treaty which offered the East India Company a better commercial and political position than it had had in 1756, and offered substantial compensation for damage done during Calcutta's occupation. John Corneille, a lieutenant in Clive's army, wrote that the English were restored, quote, not only to the full enjoyment of their ancient rights and privileges, but many more. When they captured the French factory of Chandernagore a few miles north of Calcutta, Corneille believed that the British had overcome the humiliation, and that's his word, that had been felt at losing the fort of Calcutta. By March 1757, the British had, quote, recovered that character which their pusillanimous behaviour at Calcutta had justly lost to them, and were once again looked on as a great and powerful people. Again, humiliation, revenge, honour, these are crucial. Yet, in May, 2 months later, the British continued fighting, marching on north towards the Nawab's capital, intent on overthrowing Siraj-ud-Dowlah at that moment. John Corneille did not think this was a rational act. He didn't think it was a bad thing to do either, but he suggested that the decision was based on passion. As he put it, with minds angered against the Nawab for defeating them at Calcutta, the tempting opportunity of pursuing further revenge could not be withstood. Clive again discussed the mood of revenge which motivated his soldiers on the march north. In play here was the psyche of what I've called embattled dominion. We saw a work in the Anglo-Mughal War at Anjengo, in which violence was the only response to challenge. The company had no desire to dominate Bengal or India even at that moment, but they did believe that their presence, and James can tell me I'm wrong about that, but they did believe that their presence in the subcontinent required spaces which they absolutely controlled, in Bengal, the fortified city of Calcutta in particular. Any challenge to that dominion wrought an extraordinary psychological crisis which demanded revenge. It also created mistrust on a scale which meant it was impossible, the British thought, to negotiate with the challenger again. There was, of course, no plan about what to do next. Who's ever thought of invading countries and not having a plan about what to do next? That's never happened in any other context, has it? But conquest was simply about defeating Siraj's army, not about creating institutions to rule Bengal. So in a sense, the conquest that occurred at Plassey was purposeless. It had no aim other than to prove that the British could assert power through violence, no ulterior goal beyond the feeling of satisfaction it would bring to its authors. The decision to challenge Siraj in battle was not intended to found an empire which governed institutions that governed territory throughout India, or even just its eastern part, but that is what happened. So I'm going to skip quickly through sort of the next 50 or so years of conflict. This was an empire which expanded in a mood of crisis and fear. It was governed by uncertainty and indecision, not any clear sense of purpose. Actually, before I skip on, just quickly to mention, evidence of that sort of uncertainty, indecision, anxiety is the moment before Plassey, when Clive, tossed and turned all night wondering about what to do, and this kind of really famous, iconic moment in the kind of history of British imperialism, where Clive doesn't know what to do. Should he, commit this kind of daring act, etc., of fighting, or should he not? And what he's actually doing is wondering not whether he should wait for the Marathas to arrive, because there's there are other forces that might actually come to the company's assistance. But kind of, usually this is seen as something to do with Clive's erratic temperament. But I want to suggest that it's something else. Clive's paralysis at this moment tells us something about the mood of empire rather than the mind of one man. Throughout their time in India from the 1680s to 1940s, British officers were impatient in trying to assert their command over circumstances. Their habits of feeling led them to use force to make money and secure their settlements, but also to prove to themselves that they were men of honour who could act decisively. Yet their power in India was always limited by their reliance on allies they usually did not trust and found difficult to understand. They wanted to present themselves as men who could control events, that sort of psychology of embattled dominion. But in practice, their idea of power was always out of kilter with their true ability to act. The result was a strange state of mind which oscillated between violent action and profoundly paranoid paralysis. Clive, of course, chose action, and the Battle of Plassey occurred on the 23rd of June, 1757. As I've suggested, conquest in that moment and from then onwards occurred within. That moment of conquest kind of occurred within a kind of spiral of violence similar to that which occurred at Anjengo in the Anglo-Mughal War. Anxious British officers were driven by a sense of insecurity, a desire for revenge and to assert honour in order to undo supposed wrongs and slights committed against them. But those actions created a response from their Indian antagonists, which drew further violent action. the dynamic that occurred at Plassey then led to further events, further moments. The occupation of Benares, the suppression of warlords in southern India, conflict with the Marathas, on through the kind of early 19th century to the occupation of the Punjab and the final reconquest of North India after the Great Rebellion in 1857 to 8, which I'll briefly talk about in a moment. Through this process, the dynamic was the same as possible allies offered a challenge of some kind, usually tried to renegotiate a position, which excited psychological habits of emotional reaction, to use that phrase from Schumpeter, that led to military violence and conquest. British rule spread in an atmosphere of fear and resentment, and the extension of British institutions across two-thirds of the Indian subcontinent was a consequence. So let me turn from this process of conquest to briefly think about what its consequences were and its demise. And is 10 more minutes okay, or is that too long? Until the 1830s, so conquest created a peculiar regime. Until the 1830s, at the earliest, British power in India consisted of a chaotic and uneven patchwork of different jurisdictions and regimes, some exercised by British officers in very different ways with very different legal justifications, others by Indian rulers with various different relationships to the East India Company. Efforts to create a single centre of sovereignty were made in the 1830s and 1840s, and that to some degree is the subject of my first book. But I think it was only after 1857 to 8, in the aftermath of the Great Rebellion in which British power was extirpated from much of North India, that British India became an empire or a state in any meaningful sense. And so you can see again the argument that it's only because they're attacked and kind of there's a sort of that sense of embattlement that kind of sort of an action that, if you like, creates a state occurs. The crisis of 1857 was produced precisely by the dynamics of embattled dominion that I've been discussing. It emerged as kind of sort of Indian, sections of the Indian population kind of sort of were alienated by British efforts, various different British efforts to kind of secure their rule, to centralise power, kind of to protect their borders. But it worked to, so the violence which then re-established British power after this extraordinary moment of rebellion in which kind of, British power was eliminated from large areas of northern India. The violence which re-established British power was profoundly vengeful, to the point that administrators worried about re-escalating the conflict. As a recent PhD from sadly who I didn't supervise, Jacob Smith argues, to manage the anger of British soldiers at their humiliation and defeat, calculated forms of retribution were officially sanctioned by the British and became part of the official narrative. So the need to avenge those who fell in the mutiny and to restore the honour of the British nation was enough justification for the reassertion of British sovereignty. And in a sense, 1857 kind of sort of finally eliminates the need for any other reasons for empire. It's simply, kind of the reason, kind of it would be dishonour and an act of humiliation to kind of sort of allow, kind of Indians to challenge British power. And the trope continues throughout the next 90 years or so. So the heightened concern with security, honour and retribution which followed 1857 provided an impetus behind new efforts at centralised government action, but one shouldn't overestimate the sort of their kind of systematic character. Most, one sees the growth of kind of British spending on infrastructure, kind of through the 1850s, but things like the growth of the railway system, kind of irrigation works, kind of always justified in the name of defending British authority, kind of in the name of, kind of making sure there's enough income in order to kind of pay for troops to defend the Raj, or in the case of railways, a ship moving troops around, and moving troops and kind of sort of goods necessary for government around. These kind of forms of investment, as many British capitalists complain, are not about kind of sort of increasing the economic exploitation of India. They're about kind of consolidating a regime that is, whose purpose is really just simply to retain itself there. Similarly, one finds kind of, that 1857 is a spur to legal reform as new codes of laws are passed to govern the Indian subcontinent, and for the first time one does get some kind of, pan-Indian legal system. But again, those are primarily about protecting British power. A good piece of evidence for my argument is the kind of Indian Penal Code of 1860, still the basis of the modern Indian jurisdiction, which is far more concerned with offences against the state, with kind of where there's 10 sections on offences against the state, 19 sections on acts of contempt against public servants. Refusing to answer an official's question can put you in prison for 6 months. But there are only 3 sections on murder. So there's a kind of real sense of what matters here. Kind of what matters is protecting the regime. The authors of the new legal codes, such as James Stephen and Henry Maine, explicitly saw themselves as the agents of a conquering power. That's the language they use to talk about the British presence. Their rhetorical justification was that they were imposing the law of a civilized society on somewhere that was less civilized. But in practice, the priority was always security, to mitigate imperial anxieties about resistance and rebellion, not social change. So what changes the kind of the dynamic here, I think, are, and I'm going to summarise before my last couple of pages before sort of concluding, is war and the ways in which kind of 2 world wars give the British in India a purpose that they didn't have beforehand. And they mean that the British regime in India becomes about something other than simply kind of surviving. It becomes something else than simply continuing to maintain itself, whatever that means. And so, kind of the First World War, when it has British troops and resources are used to kind of defeat the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. In the Second World War, of course, India was the base from which kind of the Japanese occupation of kind of landed Asia is defeated. And kind of so wartime, and these are very old arguments. I'm not saying anything new here. Wartime kind of sort of changes the nature of British rule in a very important set of ways. It creates pressure on Indian society. It kind of causes it increases kind of extractive forces. It means that the British actually start to be interested in making alliances with Indian quote unquote collaborators in a way they hadn't seriously been doing before. But it also increases the powers of coercion which the British use in order to kind of sort of maintain their kind of power. I think you could imagine without the, and this is sort of counterfactual history, without the First World War, you could imagine the survival of a British Empire which slowly becomes kind of a British Empire in India, which slowly becomes a kind of almost an Indian regime. As long as the British are not challenged, and as long as they maintain some kind of sovereign power, sovereign authority, kind of as long as the king or queen is, sort of is on currency, and there's some kind of sense that this is part of a British Empire, British rule in some form could have continued with large amounts of kind of Indian. Indian responsibility at various kind of levels, and one can see the kind of the decision by the British to move their capital from Calcutta to Delhi almost as kind of auguring in that kind of transition. That the move is kind of was described as this kind of enormous this great moment of sort of in which the British Empire was being renewed by moving back to the capital of the ancient Mughal Empire. But in reality, it's moving from a place, Calcutta, where the British feel embattled, endangered by debate, terrorism, argument, contest, to a totally depopulated, empty city that's just full of tombs and ghosts, and that becomes the centre of British power. But the war changes all that, and it leads to kind of the intensification of state power for a purpose in a way that hadn't happened before. And I think behind it's not surprising that one begins to see after the First World War, an expansion of opposition, obviously Indian opposition, but also kind of British violence. And of course, the Amritsar massacre, the moment when General Dyer's soldiers kill 400 or so, however many Indians gathered together in Amritsar, is a sign of that sort of the way in which kind of war, the pressures of war have increased the kind of sort of anxieties that the British kind of face. That same process kind of is occurs on an even greater scale with the Second World War, when again, not something that the British imagined India would play a great part in, but when Japan joins, it becomes a vital base, for the war effort, not only for Britain, but for the United States. The Second World War led to an unprecedented mobilization of people and resources, and also produced famine as political unrest, counteracting British repression, the alienation of sectors of the Indian population who'd previously been more positive about empire, and so on. And 1945, kind of the British state had collapsed as a consequence of these pressures. Indian society in many ways is a breaking point, with the kind of fractious violence between different communal groups occurring in kind of as a result of these kind of pressures. So kind of political institutions and the social fabric of India is just falling apart. And the British face a choice, and the choice is between leaving or reconquering. And that's kind of my point about conquest still mattering, kind of within the discussion of empire, sort of in the 1940s. And, there is, that word is used in 1946, kind of at various moments, kind of, Lord Wavell, kind of talks about the possibility of reconquering India. Of course, it's important, we would need 250,000 troops, and at the end of a war, nobody's going to, where are those troops going to come from? It's not possible, but a few people imagine it might be. Enoch Powell, kind of was in India and left India to return to Britain in order to mobilize Britons for the reconquest of India. And he wrote a paper about how this would happen. I mean, the reality is the reality, of course, is that it's a kind of political impossibility, and the British quit, and in the process they withdraw and they divide India. But I guess my sort of the final sort of case I want to make, and the final piece of evidence I want to make for this argument about kind of the sort of purposeless, unintended character, if you like, of Britain's regime in India, and perhaps differently from other parts of the empire, is what happens at the moment of the end of the British Empire in South Asia. Had there been sufficient economic interests or ideologically driven purposes, Britain's political departure would have seen the continuous involvement of Britons in a range of political and economic projects, or at least some kind of political settlement which made continuity possible. Of course, the British did want to hand over power to people who they could trust, and there were some pockets of continuity. Pakistan employed senior soldiers and civil officers. Perhaps Pakistan, with a border close to Russia and its tribal population, was seen as an outpost of informal empire of some kind. Traders stayed in a few enclaves in Kanpur until the 1960s, for example. But the speed and scale of the departure from India is remarkable. Viceroy Mountbatten's main concern was to ensure British personnel returned home safely without getting involved in the civil war he and many others thought would rage in South Asia for years. And that's something that is important, that there's this kind of sense that actually kind of the end of British war is going to create a civil war which is going to last for 20 years. Ordinary officers saw their overriding purpose as to maintain British authority. And once that goal had disappeared, there was no reason to stay, no other interest to serve, no civilizational project, nothing to stay. The presence of Britons in India was, from its beginning, imagined to involve their absolute control over the spaces they inhabited. There were no goals grand enough for British officials to pursue while sharing power. There were no goals that legitimised their sharing power with Indians. That's what I wanted to say. Politics in India was not about purpose, but instead about dominance and subordination. As the Punjab officer Edward Wakefield wrote when courted by both the Indian and Pakistani governments to stay in 1947, "I spent all my life in the service of the Crown and did not feel disposed to serve another master."